File Services, Part 2. In this nugget, we're discussing file services. This is Part 2, where we'll start off by talking about offline files, which is a great way, especially for laptop users, to be able to access files even when they're not connected to the network and they're away from the office. Also, we'll talk here about the distributed file system, which has been around through several versions of Windows, but which has really come into its own with Windows Server 2008. We'll also talk here about disk quotas, which is a great way of limiting the space that your users can use for your disks. Okay, let's start here with offline files. This is actually one of my favorite features of Windows. It's been available for quite a few years now across different versions of Windows, and it seems to be getting a little bit better at each release of a new operating system. With Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista as well as Windows 7, seems to really be working well for me at this time. Now, what is this really, though? This relates to network shares. You see, I might have something that I want to be able to access across the network on a network share. And especially for laptop users, though, this gets to really be an issue in previous operating systems because when they're disconnected from the network, now what do? Maybe they've got their laptop on an airplane 30,000 feet in the air, and they're trying to open up a presentation that they had. Well, a lot of times users aren't particularly savvy as to where these network resources are. They just know that there was a drive letter for it. Now they try to open up drive letter R, or whatever it is, and it says, unable to connect, or some word to that effect, and they can't access their files. So that's what offline files is very useful for, is it allows us to use the files even when we are disconnected from the network. Another thing that's useful for that, and I use this all the time, is I deliberately choose to work offline. For example, I work with a lot of very large Photoshop files, and on a wireless network like I often use here in my home, it's not really very efficient sometimes to open up hundreds of megabytes over that wireless connection. And it's very, very slow. So a lot of times I'll deliberately choose to work offline. This then forces my computer to work with the files in their cached form locally. And then when I reconnect to the network, it will resynchronize for me, and the synchronization mechanism is actually very, very good with all current versions of Windows. It does a good job of reconciling between changes that I have made and the old versions that are still on the network. And then if someone else has also modified a copy of the file on the network, while I have also modified the file while I'm offline, then when I come back, it'll show a message that'll tell me that there's been changes made in both locations, and it gives you good methods for deciding which copy of the file is the best one to keep, or you can keep both of them. Also, what happens here is you need to configure this in the share itself. Again, this is only for network shares, and on the network shares, there's a caching button, which we'll look at here after a little while, that can configure how this is going to be made available to the users. Alright, so in order to show how this works, I'm actually going to use not my nuggetlab.com domain, but my own production domain of accusource.local, because I've got a lot of offline file access that I use in that production network. So I'm going to show you how this actually works for my own environment. Now here I've gone to my desktop, my laptop computer, and this is just a photograph of a Chihuly exhibit. If you've never heard of Chihuly, you ought to Google him or something like that. It's Chihuly. And I think I've shown you some of his work here in the past, but this is a photograph that I took of some, I don't know what they call this, but glass orbs in a boat. And it's just a very beautiful exhibit. Well, anyway, this is one of the photographs that I work with, but another set of photographs that I was working with, I really wanted to be able to work with them locally on my laptop, even when I was connected to the network, because my wireless network is nowhere near as fast as my LAN. So if I'm disconnected from an Ethernet connection using my laptop, and I'm just sitting in the family room or something like that, or at the kitchen table working, then I'd much rather work with offline copies of the files, which actually accesses my local hard drive instead of the network. But at the same time, I'm actually still connected to the network as well, so that if I want to browse the internet or use other network resources, they are still available to me. Let me give you an example of how this works. You see, here, this is a net sculpture that is downtown Phoenix. It's in front of the Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. And this is a gigantic hung suspended net. Now, there's an artist that created this, and she calls this I think she calls it her secret is patience. I don't know how that relates. Anyway, this was at nighttime, and I'd taken my son down there, and we wanted to take pictures of this. This is the full moon that you can see right up here at the top. And to give you a sense of scale with this, if there were a person standing under this, they'd be about the size of this little magnifying glass cursor that you see right here. So that gives you an idea of how big this thing is. And it's just a suspended big old metal net, and as I zoom in on it, you can see that it's just a big mesh net that they have there. Well, anyway, this is a kind of a large file. In fact, if I right-click on this in Lightroom, I'm using Adobe Lightroom here, and choose to show it in Explorer, we can see that it is 243 megabytes in size. Well, that was a big file over a wireless network to modify this file, and then to save changes, and then to make other changes, and to resave them, and all of this kind of stuff, to shuffle that 240-some megabytes back and forth across my wireless network. So what I did instead was, as I opened this up, and I took a look at it here, is I want to be able to make this available offline. And let me go down to where it actually is down here, and it's right here. So I right-click here, and what I can do is to choose Always Available Offline. Now, it's on a wired network as we look at it right now. I plugged it into an Ethernet connection so it would perform better for the sake of my demonstration. Once I choose to make it available offline, then it will start to synchronize it for me. I can click on close. It'll actually continue to take place in the background. And while it's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and pause recording until this is complete. And what this will do is it will take all of these files, put them into a local cache for me. It's not a cache that I can read, but it's in a client-side cache, which is an actual duplicate representation of these actual files over on the network. And so when this is done, we'll come back and take a look. Alright, it looks like it completed now, so I'm going to go here and take a look at it. Now, one of the things that you'll see is a visual difference. So if I click up here and refresh the screen, you'll see that it now has the green, Microsoft calls these the swirl icon. I don't know why. Maybe it's a lot of those geeks at Microsoft used to get swirlies back when they were in junior high. But anyway, they called it the swirl icon, and this will then identify that this folder is available for me offline. Now, as we take a look at this, there's another thing we can do with this as well. Let me minimize this for a moment. I might want to see if there are any errors that took place during this synchronization. And if I click on this item here, you'll see a similar item in Vista. Then, sure enough, there is a little warning symbol on my synchronize item for Synchronize Center. So I double-click on this, and here we see that we had 6 conflicts. I wonder what that's about. You can click on this, and then I see here that there's just some temporary files that I don't really care about. So I can just right-click on that and just choose Ignore if I want for each one of these if I want to. Okay, these just don't really much matter to me. But then I have some other ones here as well. I was working on some files from Death Valley. Wonder what the deal is with these. So I double-click on it, and it tells me what the problem was. This file was deleted from one location and updated in the other location during this between the last sync. Well, then you have to just take a look at it. You see, I know that the last place that I worked on this file was on this computer. And on this computer, I had made some changes to the file that I probably actually want to keep. So I don't think I want to delete the version in both locations. This does require, someone to actually read through this a little bit and figure out what they want to do. So I'm going to keep this file in both locations. I think the same kind of thing happened down here. Yeah, sure enough, this one also, I had worked on the same file in both locations. So I also don't want to delete that file. I want to keep that one as well. And then at the next synchronize, that'll update. Then here I did a presentation for the University of California, and this is a PowerPoint presentation. It says, which version do you want to keep? This one, which is newer, or this one? Well, once again, more than likely I want to keep the newer version. If I'm really not certain, I can't just keep both versions, and one of them will be renamed with the name of the user and a version 1, okay, to keep track of that. But in this case, I again happen to know that I want to keep this version. In other words, the one that I modified on my particular laptop. So once that's done, I can go back to view the sync partnerships, and I can again sync the offline files and let them take another run at this and see if they can synchronize without any conflicts at this time. Okay, looks like everything worked okay, so we don't have any more synchronization problems. Now that's a little bit of the client side of things on how you configure that. Now let's go over here and take a look at what I was telling you about a moment ago, where maybe I'm actually connected to the network, but it's not performing fast enough, or I just want to kind of do a batch edit of a bunch of larger files. locally in the cache and then synchronize them later when I have more time. So here might I do this. Even though I'm connected to my network, I could choose work offline. Now that does not disconnect my remote desktop connection or prevent me from accessing the internet or any of those kinds of things. All that does is it kind of makes this one folder offline. And it thinks that this folder will think that it's not connected to the network while the rest of the system is still connected to the network. So we'll just go ahead and go up here and click Work Offline. And then I may get a message actually because I've got an application open now that has one of the files. And there it is. Can't work offline at this time. Why? Because I'm working with a file that has one of the files that I'm trying to work offline with. So I'd have to close that for the time being. And then I'll try again. Okay, closed one or more programs and try again. I've done that. So now I'll try it again here. And it should give me the ability now to work offline. Actually, no, it made a liar out of me, so let me try it again. Maybe it just didn't close that application up enough. Now it looks like we're okay now. Okay, so now it's successfully done, and my screen doesn't refresh very well right here through a remote desktop connection, so we see some little remnants of that old file back there. But anyway, now you get the idea. Now I could work online again once I've made all of my changes, and it would then, in its own time, synchronize back up. This is a difference between previous versions of Windows and Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista and Windows 7. In previous operating systems, it would synchronize at log off and log on. Well, now it just kind of has an intelligent manner of determining when it needs to synchronize and when there have been changes made. And it's really kind of difficult to pin down exactly when that happens. But I will say from my own personal experience, it does seem to be timely, and I haven't noticed any problems with the synchronization mechanism at this point. So now if I wanted to go ahead and minimize this and go back into Lightroom or something like that, then certainly this would still be a file that I could work with and make any changes to and so forth, and I can open that up in Photoshop, and it would again open it only from the cache and not from over the network, which would be substantially slower. Oh, let me show you this too. This is just kind of fun. I brought my son down there to kind of be my assistant, so to speak, and we just had a little bit of fun with some of this as we were setting up. We were kind of jumping in front of the camera. You can see here, and just some tricks with flash and other things like that. Doesn't resolve very well on this low resolution. Oh, there's me. Don't I look like a suave guy? But anyway, it was just kind of fun that we had down there. And if you ever get a chance down in Phoenix to take a look at that exhibit, I think it's down like at Central and First Avenue if you want to take a look at it. Okay. Now once I've done, completed my work here with any of these files, I can then go back up to this thing, choose Work Online again, and then it will in the background start to synchronize any of the changes that I might have made. Alright, now, going back over to the server side of things, let's go to, this is actually the server where I've got the actual storage attached to this server, and from where I've made the share. Now, we can't see the sharing icon on here because I'm also using a product called Carbonite, which replaces the icon. But otherwise, we'd see that. But the thing I want to get to right now is if I go to the properties and sharing, then I can go to advanced sharing, as we've been here before in our previous nugget. And then now I can go to this caching item. This directly relates to the offline files. Let me explain a little bit about what this is. This will allow exactly what you see here. And this is the default setting here, so that when I have this shared folder, if somebody decides to make the folder available offline, and by the way, you can also right-click on an individual file, it doesn't have to be a folder, but they could right-click on either one, and then they will be available offline, just like you saw me do. You can also choose all files and programs that users open from the share will be automatically available offline. So I don't manually choose an offline item, but anytime I open a file to edit it, it will then mark that for offline use so that it can be used that way. Notice that it also by default selects this checkbox called Optimize for Performance. What that's supposed to do is only use the file from the local cache whenever possible. I haven't actually noticed that there's a performance increase with this, but it says that it will perform better. When I still open the files, it seems that it's still opening them up over the network connection instead of out of the cache, so I can't see a performance increase. Maybe it's just me. And then files or programs from the share will not be available offline, and you would want to do this if you had something like classified or confidential material at least that you would not want to leave the office on your laptop. Okay, so that's the default setting that we use up there. Normally that seems to work out pretty well for me. Alright, this is one of my favorite topics here as we switch over to DFS, or the Distributed File System, where somehow or another I've wound up with some strange color pen. Anyway, with the Distributed File System, this is something we've had in previous versions of Windows, and in the first editions it was just kind of okay. It wasn't really very good for read-write data. It was mostly good for only read-only data, such as maybe web content or static documents. And so for that reason, a lot of administrators initially got excited, and then when they found out it was mostly for read-only data, it was like, well, take it or leave it. Well, now you can have actual live read-write data, and the reason why it's been changed to that in a practical manner is because the synchronization and replication is so much better than what we've had in previous versions. But I get ahead of myself. Let's talk about what this really is. What we want to do with DFS is to consolidate multiple shares and or servers into a single share namespace. You see, as users get into their file system, even on this local computer, I think I've only got 3 drive letters, but on one of my other systems, my desktop systems, I've got about 6 different drive letters that point to different shares all on the same server. Now, multiply that out in a large corporation times multiple servers in multiple locations, and you might have users with, a couple of dozen drive letters here. And of course, they can't get too much further than that because there's only 26 drive letters available, and a couple of them are probably already occupied. So you can see that that gets complicated very quickly, and then users get confused. Was I supposed to save my spreadsheets on drive Q or drive P, or where was that? So it gets to be a real big mess with this, and difficult to consolidate and organize, and difficult for the user. So this is what we're going to do with this. And by the way, let me show you a little bit about how this might look. This is just a simple example. Here I've got my accusource.local domain, and this is an accusource.local DFS file share here as well. And here I might be in the Phoenix office on my DC1 server. This is where the actual DFS root is located. And the DFS root is the starting point for all of the shares. Anything that we share will then appear underneath this whack accusource.local. Then I'll have a file share here, and that file share might actually be from this file server. And then I might have another file share under here. Okay, and this file share right here might actually be from this server. But the users, when they map a drive, maybe they're just mapping drive letter Z to this location, and now they double-click on that one drive letter, and underneath it, it looks like there's a folder here that is on this file share. In reality, it's over here. It looks like this file share also is underneath here, in the space that the user sees, but it's actually over here. And then I might have another one that may be actually another folder that's actually on this server here. You get the idea. So, it might look something like this. And maybe that is actually located up here. So the users can have a single drive letter, they click through this resource, and they access multiple shares, but they all look like they're from a single share point and from a single drive letter, and it makes the user's life much easier. Now, let me revert this so we can get rid of all of my chicken scratch here. And then we'll see a couple of other things here as well. Here I might have, a file share. Okay. And this is a very busy active file share that people in my Portland office also need all the time. Well, we also have over here, a WAN link, and maybe it's not, a stellar WAN link. It's 512 kilobits per second, which is just okay. But when users open up files from here, if they open up lots of files back and forth all the time, then they will consume that 512 kilobit per second WAN link very, very quickly. And we might not really like that. So what we might do instead is we might duplicate this file share down here in a replication group, and I'll show you how to create that in a little while. Now this is an exact copy of the same data that we have up here, and you can do this in a number of different ways. You can have it synchronize, regularly or constantly, which would still consume, of course, some of that 512 bandwidth. Or you can set it up on a schedule so that it only synchronizes during off-business hours. And then any changes that users have made to files down here will synchronize up here to the hub office. Overnight, for example, and then we'll have it set up in such a way that it'll synchronize in time for my backup software to be able to back up that software here in the hub. This is also could be a hub and spoke topology as well, if we also want to do a similar thing from my Denver office. Okay, if we have a hub and spoke, then really this is our hub, and we primarily pull data from our various remote offices here. We could also have something like a full mesh topology where each office connects to every other office. But if you get past, 8 or 10 different sites, that gets to be extremely complicated and difficult to track, and so you're better off to go to more of something like a hub and spoke topology if you're going to do that. But the basic idea here is that we can have data in multiple locations, and if we want to have duplicates of it in a replication group, we can have pretty constantly and consistent data between these two sites, or if we need to watch out for our bandwidth, we can throttle that in a number of different ways. And we'll go ahead and take a look at how to do all this. Alright, now let me go ahead and show you here how we would actually install DFS. And I started to do this in the last nugget and decided to save it for now. But you simply right-click and choose Add Services if you've already installed File Services, or you can go to Roles and add it from there if you haven't installed any File Services yet. Then I'll add them to Distributed File System, and go ahead and click on Next. And then I enter in a namespace for this. This is going to be how the users will identify this particular, share point, or the top level point of my share. So this will be called, I'll just call it data for lack of a better idea. And then we'll go ahead and hit Next. And then here we can choose to use a domain-based namespace or a standalone namespace. We should avoid this one if possible. If you've got a domain, then you should use this top one, because it'll store the configuration data about this inactive directory, which gives us better redundancy. Otherwise, your only redundancy here would be to have a failover cluster. So we're going to be using this whenever possible in a domain-based environment. And you can also choose Windows Server 2008 mode, which gives you better scalability over 5,000 potential folders if you want to use those, and access-based enumeration. So we'll go ahead and click on Next here. And then we need to identify some additional items that we want within this. So, for example, when users double-click on the data folder from within the share, because they'll now have a mapped drive that'll be going from whack whack DC Nugget 1 data, and then once they see that, we want to have something underneath data that actually contains live shares that they can use. So we'll click on Add, and I can select a folder target. I can just click on Browse and show shared folders that I have locally here, for example. There's a DC Nugget 1 share. I can click OK there, and then click OK. And then I might want to add another one too. Let me click Add again, and let's make this one from, I think I got Nugget 2 over there, Nugget 2, and then I see my Nugget 2 files. Okay, that's a file share that I used in our last nugget. So now when they double-click on this single share, they'll actually see shares from one server and shares from another server. And I've named these according to the servers, but the users might not see this. You might name these just share 1, share 2, or spreadsheets and Word documents or whatever else you want to call this. And it looks like it's, again, all going to actually be on the same server. So then I simply click on Next and Install and let this do its thing. And I'll resume recording when it's complete. Okay, now after that's been completed and I've closed and reopened Server Manager, I go down into my namespace here, and I can kind of look at what I've already configured here. So there's my nuggetlab.com data, and then here are the shares that are located within that. Now let me just show you, you can do this from anywhere, from a client, from another server, or even from the same local machine. So I'll just map a drive to that. I'll do a net use star, because I don't know what my next available drive letter is right now. And then I'm going to go to, DC Nugget 1 data. Okay, and then that's going to map that drive letter for me, and it's mapped to drive letter Z. So now I'll exit out of this and open up Windows Explorer, and I'll see that I've got a drive letter Z here now with this from my own, the same computer that I'm currently on, my DC Nugget 1 share. Remember, we looked at that in our last nugget. And then I have Nugget 2 files, and I double-click on that one there as well. Although they both look like they're on the same computer and then the same share, they're actually in different servers and different locations. And I can add almost an infinite number within practical reason to the number of shares that I want underneath this DFS point. Or DFS root. Now, let me show you another example of how I've worked this out and how this can really work nicely. I haven't configured any replication. I could do that between these two servers, but I want to show you now. I'm going to minimize this and go to my actual production network, where I've got this kind of in motion right now already. You see, if I go to my James Vista 64 computer, this is my workstation that I use every day, notice that I've already used a DFS, and I've mapped a drive letter to my DFS root, which in this case, I just named it accusource.local, and then of course you can rename this whatever you want. I just typed in DFS because it's a shorter name and easier to see. It used to be that each one of these shares had a separate drive letter, and even though I knew it was in each one of them, it got to be confusing after a while, and it had a lot of drives to go through. Now I've got a single drive letter, and it's much more intuitive for me to be able to identify one or the other of these, various items here. Okay, so it's very, very easy for me now. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can configure replication over on the server. Oh, great Scott, it's not even 12 o'clock, and it's already 99 degrees here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's supposed to get 110 tomorrow. All right, boy, feel sorry for me, people. especially in the middle of February when it's 70 degrees. Okay, so here I'm going to go now to back to my DC1 server. This is where I've actually got my DFS root configured, and you can see it right there. And I've got all those shares underneath this DFS root. Now what I want to do is I want to take possibly a portion of the data and replicate that over to another server. I've got another server called fs1.accusource.local, and maybe I have a specific folder that the people that connect to that file server need to be able to access on a regular basis. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a replication. And this is going to be accomplished by right-clicking here and choosing New Replication Group. And once I do this, I'll have a choice of two options. Number one, a multi-purpose replication group, which is just that, multi-purpose. And I'm just going to have two-way replication between two or more servers. And then I can also do replication group for data collection. And the emphasis here is, yeah, there's still going to be two-way replication, but it's going to primarily focus on sending data from hub offices that is changed up to a central hub where a backup will then be made. I'm just going to choose the multi-purpose for my current purposes, and then you just go through and answer the questions in the wizard. And I might just call this, AccuSource data, and then I can identify the domain, and you can also enter in an optional description if you want, and then I'll add the servers that I'm interested in using here, and that's going to be DC1 and FS1. Okay, so I'll enter both of those in here, and we see them now, and that's pretty much that. Then we just click on next. Here's where we choose our topology. I've only got two servers. If I had three or more, then I could choose a hub and spoke, but that doesn't really apply here. So I'll just choose a full mesh. You can also do no topology and manually create it yourself. Full mesh is much simpler in my case. And then this is where the power of DFS really starts to come to play, because you can really distinguish between when you want replication to happen, when you don't want replication to happen on a schedule, like using this bottom option for a schedule. And then you can also do, and you can kind of see how that looks, and then you can also specify how much replication bandwidth to use. I mean, maybe I've got a slow link, and I don't want to use all of my bandwidth. Maybe I only want to use 256 kilobits per second. And so I've got that option here as well. And then you get even greater power by doing what I started to show you earlier down here, by going to edit the schedule, and I can say when exactly I want replication to happen or not happen. So I can say, full replication at all times, or, during different times, let's say between midnight and, 7 o'clock in the morning, I can use full, because nobody's in the office using anything then anyway. But between these hours, let's go like this. You can see how powerful this can be. Here I only want to use during business hours 256 kilobits per second. And then over here, maybe we've got other things we're synchronizing, a database replication or something else that's also going on. Maybe we can afford a little bit more bandwidth, but not too much, so I'll go 512. And you can see you can be very distinct in terms of when and how much replication bandwidth you want to be able to use. So it's very, very cool way of working there. And then the schedule here is going to be based on the local time of the receiving member, or you can go to universal coordinated time, which is a universal time, and I kind of prefer that so that you don't have the inconsistency between time zones, for example. But it doesn't really matter for our purposes. I could just click OK there. Actually, I'm just going to go up and do a full right here. Okay, and then we just click on next, and then we specify the primary member. And the reason for this is because we might have data in multiple locations, which could be duplicated, and we need to have one of the members be the authority. So it has the most authoritative source of the data. That'll be DC1 in this case. And then I'll go ahead and click on next, and I'll add the replicated folders that I want to send from one to the other. And I'm going to make this real simple. I'm not going to replicate all my data, because I want to show this to you and allow it to replicate real quickly here. But I think if I go... I'll just go do this Moo folder, okay? There's a company called Moo.com that I publish all my business cards with, and I'll just use them, because I've got some graphics in there that I can use. So I'll just choose that one, and then I'll click OK. You can also change permissions. I don't know if you saw that, but you can also change permissions in that same dialog box if you want to. And then, of course, I could add additional folders here, but I'm not going to for the time being. I'm just going to click on Next. And then I'll edit the properties of FS1 here. So if I choose Edit, and then I can choose Enabled, now it's going to keep this folder synchronized with other members. So it doesn't actually have by default, it didn't have a replicated folder. It doesn't have a Moo folder up there. So what I need to do is to browse on this server, create a folder. I can make it the same name or some other name. Either way, the data inside of it will replicate either way. And I'll just call this one Moo as well, just for clarity's sake. And then click OK. And then click OK again, and then Next. And then from this point, it just gives you a summary of everything that you've chosen to do. It's really cool. Just click on Create, and now we'll see, hopefully, that everything says Success at the end of all of this. And looks like it's going okay. Good. All right. So we now have a replicated topology ready to go. Now, don't expect this to take place immediately. That's kind of what this is saying right here. You can kind of try to trick it into going a little bit faster, but in reality, a lot of times this will fail, at least on the initial outset. So I can go into, my connections here, for example, and I can right-click here and choose Replicate Now, and it may fail on the first time. Yeah, see, it's not able to quite find it yet. But if I give it a little bit of time, this one's found. It's found at the opposite direction, so this one might work. And we see we're able to replicate there. But anyway, if I give it a little bit more time, or if I just pause recording and try to do this again here in a little while, it should come online, and we should see over on FS1 here on the C drive that this folder right here, the MU folder, should eventually populate with files that we see over on this server. And in the DC1 over here, I've got my MU folder, okay, and there's a bunch of pictures in here is all this is. If I just choose View, Large Icons, you can see there's a bunch of pictures in here that I have. So we'll see if we can get those to replicate over to FS1. I'll just kind of keep an eye on it, and I'll resume recording once everything started to kick in. All right, through the power of modern technology here, I actually paused recording, ate lunch, watched a special on the Navy SEALs on the Discovery Channel, and now I come back, and hopefully this thing's ready to replicate now. Let's try it here. Voila, there we go. Oh, by the way, what is this thing? This is simply identifying information that's already set up. We already set all this information up earlier in the wizard, and we're going to use the normal schedule for the replication. If you wanted to, you could override that schedule for this particular purpose, and so for 15 minutes, I could use full bandwidth, or 15 minutes I could use, whatever other bandwidth I wanted to use. I'm just going to go ahead and go back to my normal schedule here, though, and click OK. And now we'll click OK here. And let's see if over on FS1, if I've got that data in the folder. There it is. Okay. Well, yippee skippy. So now we've got all of that stuff transmitted over here to FS1. Now the advantage again here is that this could be a remote office somewhere else where they don't have a good bandwidth to my hub office. Well, now they've got a local copy of all this data that they can access quite easily. And on a schedule that I determine, it can get replicated back to the hub for backup. All right, coming back here to my whiteboard, we have shown you how to configure targets. Remember, that's where I configured the DFS route. At least I did that with NuggleLab.com. And then I specified 2 shared folders on 2 separate servers. Those were my targets. Then we configured replication. Remember, that's where we can set it up on a schedule, and we can determine the amount of bandwidth to use at any given point in time. We also need to talk here now about optimization, because this can be optimized a couple of different ways. Let me go back to let's go to this one, DC1. When I go into my items here, actually I need to go up here. And when I actually go into my DFS root here, I can right-click on this and choose Properties. Notice that there's an Advanced tab right here. This Advanced tab gives me 2 options: Optimize for Consistency and Optimize for Scalability. The Consistency one will just do normal replication back and forth between my file servers, but what also happens in this is, since it's Active Directory integrated, is that the namespace servers are going to poll the PDC emulator anytime there's a change to the namespace. So anytime there's a change to this structure in any way, maybe we've added a different folder or something like that. Well, remember, since this is Active Directory integrated, that needs to get replicated into Active Directory, and it starts with the PDC emulator. Now, here's an important item that I would suspect could possibly be on the exam, and that would be to know the differences between these two. You see, if my PDC emulator is in a domain that it's extremely busy, and we've got a lot of administrators making quite a lot of frequent changes to this, that might put a burden on the PDC emulator, and we might not really be concerned about that so much for consistency anymore, as we want to lighten the load on that PDC emulator. So instead, we could optimize for scalability. This is normally going to be something you only do in really larger environments with very busy DFS infrastructure. Then what would happen is, instead of each namespace server polling its domain controller, because normally they'll all try to contact the PDC emulator across WAN links or whatever, instead of doing that, now they'll go to their closest domain controller by site link cost and at regular intervals. And then ultimately, everything is going to get synchronized and up to date, but it's only going to poll the nearest domain controller instead to find out what the current information is. And that domain controller may not be as up to date as the actual PDC emulator. The PDC emulator may have, 5 new shares that have been created under here, but the nearest domain controller has not received that replication yet, and it may not be scheduled to until, 10 o'clock tonight. But at least it reduces the burden on everybody trying to hammer the PDC emulator at once. Alright, I'm about to talk about disk quotas here, and I'll close out this particular nugget with that topic. But before we do that, I wanted to show you something else that's very cool in Windows Server 2008 that is not an exam objective, but that I think is very useful for you to know about, and this is very useful for me. The Storage Reports Management. This is another part of this shared storage management that you can add in as an additional role. And within this, I can right-click here to choose Schedule a New Report Task, add a report or remove reports for a report task. These will be items that will then, periodically check my servers over and see who's using, various files and so forth. Or generate reports now, and this is going to cause a lot of this to come to light. So, for example, maybe I want to click on Add, and I want to know who's using the most, files or the largest files on this particular drive, or a share or a subfolder if I want. Okay, then I'll click OK. And then I want to find out who has the files, and I want to find out what the largest files are, for example. Okay, once I've done that, then I can go over here to Delivery, and I can say I want to send the report to a specific email address. Otherwise, you can see here that they're going to be saved in the System Drive, Storage Reports, and Interactive. Okay, but I'm just going to go ahead and click OK here, and let that report generate itself. I'm just going to go ahead and wait for the reports to be generated and then display them instead of doing them in the background here. And we'll let it do its thing. Now, while I'm waiting for this, let me point out one reason why this could potentially actually link somewhat to quota management. With this, I might want to see who has the most files on the server, whether or not those files are really needed. I can also see, and I can move this out of the way a little bit here, I can also scan against it to see when they were most recently accessed or least recently accessed, and I can see if we really even need those files anymore, or at least contact the users about their use of those files so that we can then make a more intelligent determination on a reasonable size for the quotas that we're going to create. Another one that I really like here is duplicate files, and it looks for files that have the same date and time and are the exact same size, and then I can say, hey, we've got 2 exact copies of this gigantic ISO file. We don't really need those. So then we can delete the duplicates, and so it's very, very handy for that sort of thing. Okay, and then after that report is completed generating, then it gives me this item here, and this has got a bevy of information, a whole bunch of stuff in here that's really very useful. It tells me which user is using how much of the storage space, for example. Again, size by owner here, so I can see who's using the most. I'm really the only one that has permissions on this particular drive, so it stands to reason that I'll have probably one of the most. And then we can see what types of different files we have here as well. Very useful information there. We can see a number of other things here as well in terms of like what the largest files themselves are. Let's see. So, for example, I go down here. I see there's an actual Photoshop file there from the Grand Tetons. Wow, that's 1.2 gigabytes, 1.1 gigabytes in size. I think that's actually a big panorama that I stitched together that's out there. But anyway, so now I know the biggest files, and I can say, wait a minute, that file's way out of hand. We need to do something about that, for example. So, very useful information for that. And then the other thing I want to just briefly show you, again, I don't think this is on the exam particularly either, at least it's not listed in the objectives, is this file screening management. This is another new feature where I can set up file screens, and I can do this based on file screen templates, or I can create one from scratch. But for example, I could block people from looking at audio and video files that are on a particular share. I can block them from accessing email files. You see all these other ones that they can do. Block executable files if I don't want them to run executables that happen to be on certain servers, for example. So that's another thing that I do have the capability of being able to do. Now then, once you identify who's using how much space and come up with some data that will help you to identify a good disk quota, you can then start to limit the disk usage that people consume. You can configure this a number of different ways. It can be done from a command line. It can be done using Windows Explorer. You can use the quota management piece within Server Manager. You can use templates that are also part of the quota management. And you can set up a soft or a hard quota. A soft quota would simply state that when a user reaches their quota limit, that it sends a message, but it does not prevent them from consuming additional space. A hard quota would probably send a message, but it would also prevent them from consuming additional space, and that's the main difference between the two. So, how would I set up a quota here? Let's go ahead and start with the command line example from an administrative command prompt. And from this, I might set a quota such as this. I do a dir quota. That's your syntax. That's your command that you use for this. And then I would say the quota I want to add is on this path. That would be the, let's say, the C drive. And it could be an individual folder as well. It doesn't have to be the entire drive. So let's say if it was an individual folder, let's find one. How about DC Nugget 1 share? Maybe that would be the one I want to limit. So DC Nugget 1 share. Okay, and then I would limit it to, let's give everybody 200 megabytes, because I'm just that kind of a guy. I'm that generous. And then type equals hard or soft. I'll just put hard, I guess, for that. And then now I've successfully created that quota. If I want to confirm that in another way and take a look at it, I can also go to my server manager where I've gone to quotas, and I refresh the screen here. You saw that I already had one for the drive itself, but now here I've got one on DC Nugget 1 share that I just created. I could have also created it directly from within here as well, but before I get to that, let me show you another way of doing this as well. I could also go to the properties of the drive. Now then here, the other way that I might configure a quota is to do it on the drive itself. Now from the interface here, I can't do it on folders. For example, let me just show you. I can't go to, whatever this thing is and go to its properties. There's no quota tab or anything within that. But what I can do is to go to the drive properties and then go to the quota tab, and through administrative permissions continue on to this and enable quota management. I can set it as a hard or a soft quota. So again, this would be a hard quota, but by denying disk space to users who exceed the limit, or a soft quota only for pretty much reporting purposes. Then I would limit the disk space usage to, however much I wanted. Let's make it 300, megabytes or something in this case. Okay, and that would be limited to 300, and I would set a warning to 250 megabytes, for example. Okay, and then you can also log these events so that you can keep track of these as well. Then there's also a quota entries item down here. And what in the world is this about? Well, notice that there's already somebody there. This is the built-in administrators group. And by default, any member of the administrators group is never subject to a quota. Because you could potentially prevent yourself from being able to use files that are necessary to run the machine or to fix something. Maybe you need to download a utility to troubleshoot something, but you've already hit your quota, so now you can't fix the machine. So by default, you won't have a quota if you're administrators, but you can change that if you want to. I don't think you want to really, but you could set up at least a warning level on this if you wanted to. Okay. By the way, I find this kind of interesting. You can set up not only kilobytes, which is kind of really tiny, or megabytes, but also gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, and exabytes. Wow! Hopefully someday we'll have drives that are exabytes in size. Now, another thing I could do within this is maybe I have a given user that should be an exception to the rule for this. So I might say, building 1 user 01, they are my special exception. They need more space. So I'm going to limit their disk space as well, but it's going to be 500, megabytes instead of, what everybody else has. Okay, so that might be the case. Maybe they're in management. Maybe they are a photographer. Maybe they're a videographer. Maybe they work with larger files. If they're a photographer or videographer, I better give them a lot more space than that, though. So we'll give them a huge amount of space here for that kind of thing. Okay, so you get the idea there is you can custom configure that however it might suit your purposes in those instances. Actually, I don't want to even do that right now. I don't want to set up the quota on my drive C. But you can see here that you only set this up if you intend to use the actual quota themselves. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cancel all of this out so that we can now go to the quotas item here within quota management. Now this is actually really cool. What I can do with this is I can right-click here to choose Create Quota, and the interface here is pretty easy. There's not a whole lot involved in this. But one of the advantages here is I can create a quota on a path. So, for example, again, maybe I only want to create a quota on a given folder instead of the entire drive. I could do it that way, and then derive properties from this quota template. If I want to, I can specify one of these other templates that are already in existence. I'll talk to you more about those templates here shortly. But some of these are already pre-configured for us. Okay, so I'll just say 100 megabyte limit, for example. Or I could choose to define custom quota properties, and by doing this one here, then I can again fill in the data as necessary. And again, this is pretty self-explanatory when you look at the dialog box. Okay, all right. So there's that. We could configure it that way. The other thing, though, is these quota templates, and this is really very powerful. I would expect this to be an exam item that you should be aware of. And the key advantage with this is I could create a quota based on one of these templates, and then what I could do is, let's say I apply that same template to, I don't know, a dozen shares. But then it turns out that we've been able to upgrade the hard drives on those dozen shares and give people more space. So all I would have to do is go to one of these existing quotas that we already have, like this one, and maybe I want to increase that to 500 megabytes. Well, if I edit this template and I increase it to 500 megabytes now, then it'll apply to all of the drives to which it originally was applied. Let's just go ahead and take a look at that. Here I'm just going to really quickly set this up. I'm going to create the quota, and I'm going to get to a location here. I'm just going to set this up so you can see it. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply a quota template here. Let's go to this 250 megabyte extended limit. We'll use that one. Okay. So we create a template, create a quota based on that template, and there it is. Now I go to my quota templates, and look, if I double click to edit this thing and make it 500 megabytes, and then click OK, then it tells me, apply template only to derived quotas that match the original template. You see, what this relates to is, even though I've created a quota based on a template, I could go back in at a later point in time and modify those settings so that it goes outside of what the original template said. If I choose this top option now that I've changed that original template, then it's really pretty much the same as saying it's only going to apply to any of the quotas that have not been custom modified after I applied that template. In other words, if it matches exactly the way the template originally appeared. I can also choose apply template to all derived quotas. That means anything that's been custom modified or not, either way, or do not apply template to derived quotas. So this would be, again, a way of doing it in a very, very broad scope to apply to everything and kind of blasting on down through. And now those original quotas that I had set up, well, you'll see that they now will have, if I refresh the screen here, a different quota. And the name of it is still called 250 megabyte extended, but you'll see here that if I expand out the limit, you'll see that that now has changed to 500 megabytes. In this nugget, we took a look at file services. This was part 2, where we started by talking about offline files. Remember, this is a great way to access files even when you're not connected to the network, or when you want to just improve performance by working with files directly out of the cache on your hard drive instead of pulling them across the wire. We also took a look at the distributing file system, which is a great way to centralize your resources into a single share, which might actually be on different servers but appear to be in a single location. Makes things a lot less confusing for your users. Also, we took a look at disk quotas, which is a great way to limit the amount of disk space that your users do consume. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.